When you read a Bible story, it really is a kind of Rorschach test where the same thing can be read very differently by very different people. Some people read the Genesis story in the first few chapters of the Bible and see it as a documentary of what actually happened at the beginning of the universe. Others read the story, and while they don't think it's literally true in terms of exactly how things happened one day at a time for 7 days to create the world, they nevertheless feel it has some kind of spiritual underlying truth to be discovered, that there's some spark of divinity and creation that still has some impact in the world and still shows the fingerprints of some kind of designer, even if it's not the kind of mechanistic version you see there. These are people, by the way, who harmonize the concept of evolution with the concept of some kind of divine involvement in that process of gradual change. And so they might see the days of the first week as allegories for thousands or millions of years, but still maintaining some kind of coherent truth-telling structure. And then there are people like us who generally see the story as a story written by people, a story that's a kind of origin story for many important factors of the human experience, as we'll see. But in the end, it's not true in terms of actually happening. Yet it could still ring true. It could still resonate with the human experience if its descriptions of human dynamics and needs and fears and desires are still true, are still part of who we are. That's what makes some literature timeless, is that it continues to resonate no matter what the circumstance or place or part of the world. There's an apocryphal story about the musical Fiddler on the Roof. It actually didn't happen, but the story's been told a lot, that when the writers of Fiddler on the Roof took it to Japan, people there said, well, we understand why we love the story here, but why did they like it in America? Because it was a universal story of tradition and generational change and fighting. Well, it didn't actually happen. That story didn't happen, but it's a nice story. And it says something about the universality of certain themes in human experience. So when we dive into the story in Genesis at the beginning of the Hebrew Bible, we'll find some of those universal themes that continue to resonate in our experience, while we may also find some elements that are more passé from our understanding. After all, you might have even gotten a bit at the end of the lyrics of that song where Eve is singing and she says, well, being on permanent vacation in the Garden of Eden is okay if you're a crustacean. Like, that's not particularly interesting if you have ideas and invention and creativity and you want to learn and discover things. Well, maybe Eve is the hero for eating the fruit from the tree and opening our eyes, as opposed to the villain for having brought death into the world. Again, it all depends on how you read that ink blot on the Rorschach test. So I'm going to share my screen right now to share the text of Genesis from a website called Sepharia, which is a wonderful resource for Hebrew text, but also for English text, and for a variety of commentaries and other Jewish sources as well. That's one of my go-to sources. So we start at the very beginning, and I'll point out that the name of the book in Latin, Genesis, actually has more to do with the content of the book in terms of genetics, generating, creation. In Hebrew, often the name of the book is simply the first word or two in that particular section. And the name of the Torah portion is also generally the first word or two in that section. We'll see a couple examples tonight. So this begins with Bereshit, which literally means in the beginning, or at the beginning, or at the start of. You might notice if you read a little bit of Hebrew, you'll see the word Rosh in the word Bereshit. Rosh, if you remember from Rosh Hashanah, means the head of the year. So Bereshit is at the beginning. But notice in the English translation, this is not King James here. In the King James Bible, we remember from English literature class, in the beginning, God created the heaven and the earth, as if that is the starting point of all time. In this translation, following some Jewish interpreters, most especially Rashi, who lived about 1,000 years ago, it's more in the beginning of God's creation, when God began to create heaven and earth, as if we're coming in the middle of the story, or at least after chapter 1, because we don't hear where God came from. We don't hear why there was a decision to create anything. We just catch it in chapter 2 at the beginning of the creation process. So that's where even the small translations make a big difference. in how you understand the theology, the cosmology, and what kind of story the story is trying to tell. One other thing I'll point out, you can see in the very first verse, again, reading in the Hebrew, it has Bereshit bara Elohim. Now, Elohim is the word for God that you'll see translated as G-O-D in most Bibles, but it looks like a plural word in Hebrew. Normally, when you have im at the end, it's a plural. Yeled is a child, yeladim is children, or chaver is a friend, chaverim are friends. So is Elohim the plural of El? If El is a god, is Elohim the gods? Well, in this case, it would seem to be something else because the verb is singular. Now, it could be a collective. It could be the gods create as one sort of group entity, like the Big Ten, a conference of teams. It's actually 14 teams now. Or it could be that a later generation modified things. And at one time, it might have been created in a plural form with the gods. And again, that would fit more in a mythological, polytheistic setting. We don't really know. But in the end, later generations who were the ones who finally wrote down the stories and did the grammar pointing and everything, almost always in the Hebrew Bible, Elohim takes a singular verb. Even though the form is plural, the verb is singular, and this is the first example. So here we have the beginning of creation, the heaven and the earth. Going on to verse 2, the earth was unformed and void, darkness over the deep. And there's an interesting comparison. The word deep here is tehom, and there's a Babylonian creation story that refers to Tiamat as a primordial beast that had to be destroyed, and maybe Tiamat and tehom have some kind of grammatical relation to each other. I have to point out, this is one of the most deeply mined sections of the Hebrew Bible, this first Torah portion from chapter 1 through the beginning of chapter 6. So if I kept you here for 4 hours, we wouldn't have time to get into everything. So I'll have to sort of self-restrain and make room for more progress. And we will stop periodically to open up for comments, questions, and so on. But first, let me get through the original creation story. So God says, and this is in verse 3, Vayehi or, let there be light. Vayehi or, and there was light. So right away, you see the power of words and talking, simply by saying, and then there was. That's the power of creation. And notice Adam takes a bit of that power later too, when he gets to name the animals. What he calls them, that's what they are. Even if they existed in form before, they didn't have a name, and he gets to use his words to name the animals. So there's a sort of imitation parallelism there, where God names things like light, and then there is, and God names the horse, and that's what it is. God saw the light was good. He separated the light from the darkness. He called the light day and the darkness night. And there was evening and there was morning, a first day. Notice that pattern, by the way, in verse 5. Vayehi erev, vayehi boker. There was evening and there was morning. How does the Jewish calendar run today? Evening and then morning. Erev Rosh Hashanah and then the day. Hanukkah begins at night. Passover begins at night. The holidays and the Jewish days begin at night. And so this is in some ways an origin story for that ritual, for that routine of marking the beginning of your days at evening and then in morning. Let there be an expanse in the midst of the water. It may separate water from water. This is a play on the Hebrew. Mayim is water. Shamayim is sky. And so the idea is that the sky is really water put up, and then there's the water left below. That's the ocean, the rivers, and so on. And it's sort of, again, an origin story for the etymology of Mayim for water on earth and Shamayim for literally the water up there in the sky. And so he calls the firmament and the sky Shamayim, sky, and again, evening and morning, a second day. Now the water is gathered into one area for dry land to appear. The dry land is called earth, and Eretz, it says, and the gathering of waters are called the seas, and this is also good. Now the earth sprouts vegetation, plants, and so on. You see how it's very systematic. You've got water, you've got land, you've got plants, you have vegetation coming out. This is all good. And there was a third day. Now on day 4, verse 14, let there be lights in the expanse of the sky to separate day from night. They will serve as signs for the set times, the days and the years, and lights for the expanse of the sky to shine upon the earth, the two great lights, the greater light to dominate the day, and the lesser light to dominate the night and the stars. Obviously, the sun and the moon. You might ask, how did the plants do on that first day without any sun? Well, it was only one day, maybe they managed. But that's, again, trying to put scientific categories into a mythological origin story. They don't always fit very well. And so there's evening and morning. There's a fourth day with the sun and the moon. Day 5, let waters bring forth swarms of living creatures and birds that fly above the earth, the great sea monsters, all the living creatures of every kind. He said to them, Pru uravu, be fertile and multiply. Literally, Pru is the same root as pri, fruit. Be fruitful. That's why it's often translated that way. But literally it means be fertile and to be multiplied, to fill the water and seas. There's evening and morning a fifth day. And on the sixth day, we get the land animals, living creatures, cattle, creeping things, wild beasts, and so on. And this is good too. And now verse 26. And here's where, again, the number of Elohim becomes up for debate. Vayomer, which is a single form, Elohim, God, Naaseh Adam B'Tzalmenu. Let us, we, plural, let us make humanity in our image. Gidmutenu, like our form. Well, is that the royal we like a king? Or is that the collective we of the gods? Well, again, certain commentators would ask one thing and others would explore in a different direction. And so, Vayirdu bidgat hayam uvaof hashamayim, they will rule the fish of the sea, the birds of the sky. They'll be the pinnacle of creation. Notice how creation is getting better and better. You have just abstract light and dark, but then you get new forms and new images and more complex things and more complex animals. And then ultimately the pinnacle of creation is humanity. We are number one. And so God created man in his image. In the image of God, he created him. Male and female, Zacharu Nekeva bara otam, he created them. So it would sound like male and female are created at the same time, and both in the image of God, whatever that means. Maimonides would read the image of God as having a rational mind. Others read the image of God as literally being shaped like us. And so there are medieval Haggadot that refuse to show a human face because the human face is the image of God. And so in these medieval Passover Haggadot, they have a bird's face instead of a human's face. It's called the bird's head Haggadah because they didn't want to create an image of God, understanding it very literally as the same as the human face. God blessed the people, and he says to them what he said to the animals. Pru ravu, be fruitful and multiply, be fertile and increase. Fill the earth and master it and rule all of those animals. But notice they start out vegetarian. I give you every seed-bearing plant that is upon the earth, every tree that has seed-bearing fruit. They shall be yours for food. And to all the animals, all the birds of the sky, he said, I give all the green plants for food. Now, what the lions and the cougars felt about eating grass, we're not sure. Again, we're trying to put modern categories into ancient stories, but that's the ideal version, the Edenic version. The paradise version is vegetarianism. And there are some Jewish vegetarians today who would read this story and see it as advocacy for their perspective. And at the end of this chapter, God saw all that he had made and found it not just good, not just tov, but tov ma'od, very good. There was evening and there was morning the sixth day. And this wraps up at the beginning of chapter 2, the first of the aliyot, the first of the formal Torah readings you'd hear in a synagogue. The heaven and earth were finished and all their array. On the seventh day, God finished the work he had been doing. He ceased on the seventh day from all the work he had done. And God blessed the seventh day and declared it holy, because on it God ceased from all the work of creation he had done. Such is the story of heaven and earth when they were created, when the Lord God made earth and heaven. So there we go. Now, what's interesting about this story, if you ended at verse 3 here, and God blessed the seventh day, declared it holy, and that's all that was done. This is, by the way, these first few verses here are part of the traditional Shabbat wine blessing or Kiddush that's shared in the home. You have a 7-day creation with the pinnacle of creation being humanity and an origin story for the very holiday we're observing today called Shabbat. And that would seem to be the end of creation, except the story goes on in chapter 2. And you might have noticed here it says, when the Lord God made heaven and earth, What does that mean? The Lord God. Well, in the Hebrew, it is Yud He Vav He Elohim, often read as Adonai Elohim, but we're not afraid of getting struck by lightning by saying the name as written. So it might have been Yahweh or Yehovah or something like that. In any case, Yahweh Elohim, or the Lord God, is a different divine name. It might be even Yahweh of the gods, like Zeus of the gods, or Ares of the gods. Well, if it's one of the gods doing things, that's a different kind of story. And then it says, when no shrub of the field was yet on earth, and no grasses of the field had yet sprouted, because God had not sent rain upon the earth. So now, wait, did we just go back to day 3 before the plants had come out? Well, okay, let's imagine we've zipped back in time to the plants. The Lord God formed man from the dust of the earth. He blew into his nostrils the breath of life, and man became a human being. Now, notice here as well, he formed him, Yatsar. That's like taking mud and clay and molding it and breathing it. That's not saying let there be. What happened to let there be? Just use words. Well, this seems to be a very different creation story. In fact, scholars believe this may have been a totally different freestanding creation story that later was combined with the Genesis chapter 1 story and creates a kind of redundant repetition of the story with different agendas and different people holding different versions of the story wholly, but nevertheless understanding them as both true in some kind of supernatural way. And after man is formed from dust of the earth, he plants a garden in Eden, and he places the man he had formed. And from the ground he caused to grow every tree pleasing to the sight and good for food, with the tree of life, that's new, in the middle of the garden, and the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. Ooh, magic trees. That's also a very different style of story. A river comes out of Eden to water the garden. It divides and becomes 4 branches, and this describes the different branches of the rivers, most famously the Tigris and Euphrates, which you see in verse 14. Yahweh, the God, took the man and put him in the Garden of Eden to till it and to tend it. And he commanded the man, saying, of every tree of the garden you are free to eat, but as for the tree of knowledge of good and evil, or good and bad, you must not eat of it, for as soon as you eat of it, you will die. So we have, again, not only a magic tree, but a forbidden tree. This is the origin of the whole concept of forbidden fruit and why it's so tempting. Yahweh the God said, it's not good for man to be alone. Now, this is one of those pieces of wisdom that's still amazingly true. It's not good for us to be alone. Hello, have anyone been paying attention the last 6 months? It's not good for us to be alone. We need other people. And so this is one of those timeless pieces of wisdom that I think does ring true through the modern period, because it's a basic insight into the human nature and human psychology. And so God decides, I will make an Ezer Kenegdo, a helpmate to be opposed to him or to be next to him. It's often translated as a fitting helper for him. But notice now Yahweh the God creates all the wild beasts and all the birds of the sky, and man names them. Wait a minute. I thought we were on day 3. They just made man and then the plants and now the animal, but the order is totally different in chapter 1. Again, one of those seams in the combining of the stories that suggests they may have been different stories with different agendas. Because you'll notice in this story, instead of starting with chaos and disorder and going to the pinnacle of creation and humanity on day 7, or day 6 to day 7, here we start with order and plans and everything falls apart. So man gave names to all the cattle and the birds, but he did not find a fitting helper for himself. And so Yahweh the God puts a deep sleep upon the man, and while he sleeps, one of his ribs or his side is taken and the flesh is closed, and so he fashions an Isha, a woman from an Ish, from the man, and brings her to him. And this, he says, this one is bone of my bone and flesh of my flesh. If you wonder where that phrase came from, this is it. This shall be called woman, from man she was taken. Hence a man leaves his father and mother and clings to his wife, so they become one flesh. The Hebrew is actually davak, which is the same word as glue in modern Hebrew. He sticks to his wife, and they become one flesh. The two of them were naked, arumim, but they felt no shame because, of course, they knew no good or evil. In fact, one of the interesting insights I had reading this story just today, first time I'd ever thought about this, is that maybe this is a discussion of the origin story for human sex. How man and woman become one flesh, not metaphorically, physically. And so maybe it's trying to describe it. It's a kind of trying to reclaim that original primordial unity, that there's a reason why we fit together that way, that's part of the origin stories included in this Genesis origin. So I want to stop at this point and open up and ask if anybody has any questions to explore those first couple chapters before we go on to the really exciting stuff with sex and murder and all kinds of other human drama. Please.
The second chapter, it seemed like such an embellishment. The first chapter was, here it is. And then it was like so embellished and verbose.
Right. You can even feel the style is different, you know, the rhetoric and the literary style. Absolutely. That's, again, why people imagine there might have been different authors writing different parts of the story, just because the style is different, the drama is different, the rhetoric, the vocabulary they're using when they're talking is different. Obviously, the creation is much more hands-on, you know, than just let there be and speaking and letting it happen. You can really feel the difference. Once you're open to accepting that it might have been by different people at different times, that opens up all kinds of ways to read it that the traditional model wouldn't include.
When you started speaking, and you were talking about whether this really happened, and we, you know, most of us in the humanistic community don't think so, some do. I was reminded of an aphorism that has great currency in the storytelling community, where they say, all stories are true. Some of them even happened. And the question, of course, is what does it mean to be true? That means that there's something in it that speaks to us, that makes it interesting, that keeps it alive. Certainly these stories have been alive and part of our tradition for a long time. So the question becomes, why is that? What speaks to us that keeps it interesting, even those of us who don't think it really happened?
You know, I think the word truth is really tricky. I mean, you may remember during the George W. Bush administration, there was a discussion about truthiness. We've heard discussions more recently about alternative facts and how that works. You know, sometimes the idea of true as true versus false is important. But the idea of true as an emotionally true or resonates or rings, something rings true, you know, that's a different kind of truth. It was sometimes referred to as a poetic truth. It's different from a factual truth. And so it's helpful for us to keep those concepts clear sometimes, because if people say Genesis is true without the qualifier or without explaining what they mean, you might take something very different from it than what other people might mean by that.
Well, and I'm thinking about another thing I've thought about for a bit. What we read in the newspaper, what happened, that we forget rapidly a few days later. That's true, it really happened, but it doesn't stay with us. Some of the things that didn't really happen, including the stories we're talking about now, even if they didn't really happen, they stay with us. So there's true, and there's true in the sense of really happened. There's true in the sense of speaks to us and means something to us. And sometimes I think they're structured the same way, but I also think they're different narratives.
There's a book called Who Wrote the Bible?
Mm-hmm.
And talking about the premise that you just said, that there are multiple authors and how they overlap and how you can really tell the difference between them. And this was part of it.
Absolutely. In fact, the best part about the book is the cover, because it says, "Who wrote the Bible?" ? Richard Elliott Friedman. He's the author of the book. It's not that he wrote the Bible, but that's sort of a funny premise. Yeah, Lori, please.
One of the things that my training has brought on is that origin stories very often are written to justify existing social structures.
Well, we'll get to that on this one for sure.
Yeah, but what struck me right away was that in the first version, man and woman are created equally and are both in the image of God. But in the second version, now woman is secondary to man. She is no longer the equal of man. She's now she's the helpmate. Okay, and so right away we have a patriarchal system kicking in here, which is who's in charge, and the man is naming everybody and doing everything, and woman is sort of subsidiary. Anyway, just that struck me
Oh,
right.
yeah, absolutely. And in fact, in the sort of founding of the American feminist movement, you had two giant women who were giants in the movement, Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton. But Elizabeth Cady Stanton often got less attention because she was more radical theologically. And she would look at the Genesis story and say, this is appalling. And people have used this for centuries to keep women down. And so we have to challenge that too. And Susan B. Anthony said, let's stick to the laws. Let's not challenge the church too at the same time. But another one in the Cady Stanton school was a Jewish woman named Ernestine Rose, who was both a radical feminist and abolitionist starting in the 1840s, and a humanist and a strong critic of the Bible and religion's oppression of women. And she would often get booed off of stages for saying these outrageous things, that religion is oppressing women using stories like this. But she was right. She was just ahead of her time, and people weren't always willing to hear what she had to say. All right, let's dive back into the Genesis story, because we'll see a little bit more about what happens on the gender dynamics in chapter 3. Now here again, you get a wonderful pun at the beginning that you can only get in the Hebrew. So notice at the end of chapter 2, verse 25, it says, "Vayishnehem arumim," the two of them were naked, arum. And it begins in chapter 3, "V'hanachash aya arom mikol chayat hasadeh." The snake was cleverer, was the shrewdest, because in Hebrew, arum is naked, arom is clever. And so it's using the same play, the same word sound for naked and clever that, again, you miss in the English, but the word play is beautiful in the Hebrew. So the serpent is the sharpest, the slyest of all the animals that Yahweh the God made. He said to the woman, "Did God really say you cannot eat of any tree in the garden?" How clever, right? He starts with a question, and he questions this rule. And he says, you can't eat any tree from any tree. He knows what he wants to get to, but he's going to lead her there by questions instead of declaration of statements. And she says to him, "We may eat of the fruit of the other trees of the garden. It is only the fruit of the tree in the middle of the garden that God said, you cannot eat from it and you cannot touch it, lest you die." Now, the careful reader might have noticed, God said nothing about touching. He said, do not eat from it. On that day, you'll die. So where did Eve get the concept of touching? Well, here's where commentary jumps in, right? There's a space in the text. There's an opportunity, a question mark that's raised. And so they imagine that maybe Adam, when he was conveying these commandments to Eve, remember, she wasn't alive yet. She was still in ribio, or whatever we would call it, hasn't come out yet. And she didn't hear the command about the tree. So when Adam is passing on the command, he added this extra layer. You know, don't turn on the stove and don't even touch the stove. Don't eat from the tree and don't even touch the tree. And so then the commentators imagine that the serpent, who still has feet at this point, is standing next to Eve, and he bumps into her, and she bumps into the tree, and nothing happens. And she says, well, if Adam said, don't touch it, and I touched it and everything's fine, then maybe I can eat from it too. So this is one of those spaces in the text that creates an opportunity for commentary, story, exploration. She says we can't even touch it. And the serpent says to the woman, you will not die. God knows that as soon as you eat of it, your eyes will be opened and you will be like gods, Elohim. You'll be like gods, Yod'eh Tov Vara, knowing good and evil. So what makes the gods is not eternal life. They're eating from the tree of life. What would make them gods is knowing good from evil. I'll point out, it would also make them human, right? This is an origin story for humanity. And if they don't know good from evil, then how human are they really? In fact, they're like babies until they learn good from bad. So the woman saw the tree was good for eating, a delight for the eyes, and it was desirable as a source of wisdom. And the word in Hebrew is lehaskil, to get enlightenment. She took of its fruit and she ate, And she also gave some to her husband, and he ate. By the way, you could imagine that she might have just eaten it and then lorded it over him for the rest of their life, right? But she gave it to him, and he ate as well. And now their eyes were opened, and it doesn't say they learned good from evil. They saw they were naked, because good and evil includes shame, includes body image issues. It includes psychosis, right? The challenges we have with higher knowledge. And so they sewed together fig leaves and made themselves loincloths. And they heard the sound of Yahweh the God moving in the garden at the breezy time of the day. I mean, again, look at the mythological setting. He's taking a stroll in the garden at a certain time of day. And they hid from him among the trees. I mean, think about, where did they hide? They hid in the trees. Talk about calling attention to the problem. He called out to the man and said, Ayecha, where are you? I heard the sound of you in the garden, and I was afraid because I was naked. So knowing good from evil doesn't make you smart, right? Because what Adam does here is give away the game. He says more than he needed to. When you're on the stand, they always say, don't answer more than you have to. Well, he answers more than he has to by saying, I was naked, so I hid. And then God said, who said you were naked? Did you eat of the tree which I forbade you to eat? Now, does Adam pass the test here of knowledge? No, eating the knowledge of tree of good and evil doesn't make you responsible either. The woman you put at my side, she gave of me of the tree and I ate. So he blames two people before accepting responsibility. First, he blames God for giving him the woman, and then he blames the woman. And only finally says, and yes, I ate. So Yahweh the God said to the woman, what have you done? And she also passes the buck. The serpent duped me, and I ate. Now, it's interesting that God doesn't ask the serpent what was going on. In fact, one of the commentators speculates the serpent was too sly even for God and might have talked him out of it. So God didn't give the serpent a chance to talk. Then Yahweh the God said to the serpent, because you did this, more cursed will you be than cattle and all the wild beasts. On your belly you crawl, and dirt you eat. This is thought to be an allusion to the way that snakes shed their skin. I will put enmity between you and the woman, and between your offspring and hers. They will strike at your head, and you will strike at their heel. So this is why we don't like snakes, and why they crawl on their bellies with no legs. To the woman he said, I will make most severe your pangs in childbearing. In pain you will bear children. So now, why does labor hurt? Now we know. But your urge shall be for your husband, and he shall rule over you. It's getting back to what Lori alluded to earlier. And to Adam he said, because you did as your wife said and ate of the tree, cursed be the ground because of you. By toil you will eat of it all the days of your life. Thorns and thistles it will sprout for you, but your food will be the grasses of the field. By the sweat of your brow you will get bread to eat until you return to the ground. And here's that famous line, Ki afar ata ve'el afar tashuv, because you come from dust and to dust you return. And so this is an origin story for mortality, for man's labor and women's labor in those different categories, and even the basic connection of humanity to the earth, the idea of a burial culture and the idea that we decompose and turn back into soil. In fact, you get that also in the Hebrew play between Adam, which means humanity, and Adamah, which is the word for earth or ground. So Adam called his wife Chava, from Chaya, from life. She was the mother of all living. And now Yahweh makes garments. Notice what his garments are made of, though. Of skins. Now there's death in the world. Now the animals are dying. Now there are skins that they can use to make. It's another stage in the evolution of the world. And Yahweh the God said, now that man has become like one of us, like a god, knowing good from evil, what if he stretches out his hand and takes the tree of life and live forever? And so God banished him from the Garden of Eden to till the soil from which he had been taken. And again, you hear that Adamah, Adam play in here. He drove the man out and put east of the Garden of Eden the angels and the fiery sword to guard the way to the tree of life. Well, high drama, right? You have that social dynamic. You have what makes us human in having knowledge, why we die, why we don't like snakes, why we eat animals now, right? The story has to end that way, though, because if it's an origin story that doesn't end with how we are now, then it doesn't do its job. You've got to end with the way things are now. So I wanted to stop for a minute, ask if there are any questions, comments, and then I want to do the last section of chapter 4, and we can blow through 5 and the end of 6 at the beginning of 6 pretty quickly. But any questions or comments on that chapter 3, that high drama of the tree of knowledge and so on?
So what I wanted to ask was, what happened to chapter 1 and that whole story of Adam and Eve being equal and so on? That never comes back, right? So the continuation is it's not really a continuation. Chapter 1 is on its own, and then 2 and 3 follow, right?
But what this does, you're right, that they could be read as standalone stories. But because they're both included in the book, it creates this dynamic that literary scholars call intertextuality, where two texts are in dialogue with each other. You know, so you have the original Binding of Isaac story. But if I write a poem about the story from Isaac's point of view, now that text is in dialogue with the earlier text. So the next time I read the Binding of Isaac story, I'm going to be thinking about what Isaac might have thought about based on this poem. So that's how these two stories work together too, that you read the first story and you wonder, is the second story just an episode included in the first story? Is it a rebuke of the first story, which had Adam and Eve equal, and the second one makes Eve clearly subordinate in many ways, both before the fall and after the fall? You know, before she's the helpmate, she's from his rib, she's secondary, and after the fall, she's punished by having to submit to her husband. Well, you know, is it in dialogue with the earlier story? It may be. Roger?
Yeah, isn't there a third that didn't get included in this canon, but that has Lilith before Eve, and Eve is either his equal or his helpmate, but wasn't Lilith originally his equal in the Babylonian, the origin stories that are similar to this?
No, but yes and no. I'll put it that way. So Lilith is a good character to bring in here. This is related to the word for night. There was sort of an owl goddess in Babylonian mythology who was known as Lilith, but it's not original to Hebrew mythology. It really doesn't make its appearance until later in Jewish history, like in the early rabbinic period. And the idea was that there were actually two creations of people. The first creation was Adam and Lilith, who were created at the same time and who were equal, so much so that Lilith insisted on being on top during sex. That's actually what the rabbinic commentaries say. And so she wouldn't put up with Adam trying to boss her around. And so when she refused to do that, she said the divine name and flew off and became a demon that will tempt Adam at nighttime and kill thousands of his children over the course of his life. This is, again, an origin story for nocturnal emissions or wet dreams or whatever, as killing the seed. That's from Lilith the demon. It's her fault. That's why it's happening. And then the second creation of Eve is appropriately subordinate and secondary, and she knows her place, in theory. Again, this is a medieval story trying to explain the social order, but projecting it back into the creation story, imagining Lilith as the chapter 1 creation and Eve as the chapter 2 creation. So it is a bit later that this shows up in the canon of mythology. It's not original, but it is a way to try to resolve that contradiction. Thanks, Roger. Yeah, Susie, one more, and then Lori, and then we're going to go on.
Yeah. Okay, to go into something far less interesting than your digressions, but what's always bothered me about these passages. So God says to Eve, to Adam and Eve, don't eat this or you will die. What on earth would we think that they had a concept of die at that point? I mean, it's sort of like my mother threatening me when I was a little kid, do what I say or else. It's like this big void. What's the else? What's death? Is there any commentary about that?
And an origin story for Hanukkah that has a connection to this. So after Eve and Adam are expelled from the garden, and remember, this is imagined to happen around the time of Rosh Hashanah as a creation of the world. So a couple of months later, it starts getting darker out and darker out and darker out. And Adam thinks, well, maybe this is how I die. The sun goes out, because it doesn't say when or how he's going to die. It just says he's going to die at some point. It's not the lightning bolt. And then he realizes that that's the way of the world when the sun gets brighter and brighter again after the winter solstice. And so then he creates a holiday where you light lights that time of year in celebration of the sun's rebirth. And so that explains why the Romans do it. That explains why other cultures do it, not just the Jews doing Hanukkah. But that question of what does death mean, and they don't know exactly what it means. As we'll see in chapter 4, it could even be caused by people. And they don't know that yet because nobody's been murdered until chapter 4. Yeah, Lori.
Yeah, so I have a question. Sir, in Christianity, they talk about God being omnipotent and, all-knowing and all-powerful and so forth. He doesn't appear to be all-knowing because he would have been able to foresee this all happening if he was. And he certainly didn't know where people were hiding in the garden, and he didn't know what the snake had done.
Well,
the question is whether or not, or is he just putting everybody on?
Okay, so when you're playing hide and seek with your kids, and you say, "Oh, where's Johnny?" You may know where he is, and you're playing a game with him, or you're saying, "Where's my real Adam? Where's the Adam I knew? That Adam is gone." All right, or who told you were naked? That's testing Adam to see what he's going to say. Does he say, "Naked? What's that? I have no idea." Or does he come up with another story? Or does he admit it? Or does he blame other people? So you can read it into this. What makes biblical literature so interesting / challenging is that there's so much space in there for this kind of discussion, interpretation, commentary, and speculation. Look, there are generations of Jewish commentators who start with the assumption that the God in the Genesis stories is the all-powerful, all-knowing God who does everything. And then they have to figure out why he says, "Where are you?" Now, when we look at the story, if we think of it as a mythology where Zeus is not all-knowing and Hera is not all-knowing, otherwise the mythology would be really boring, right? Zeus goes to have an affair and Hera says, "I already know about that." There's nothing interesting there. They have to be less than all-knowing to make the mythology creative. So we read it differently. We think that maybe God doesn't know where Adam is. He's been fooled, or he's shocked. He's surprised at what happened. It's not part of the plan. But there are plenty of commentators who've tried to make it part of the plan as part of the test of free will, and Adam failed. And so now he has to deal with the consequences. Once you have an all-powerful God and free will, you have an inherent paradox there. And any religious tradition that tries to maintain both concepts is going to have trouble. One of the interesting things about Spinoza is that he posited an sort of an all-powerful God, but in the form of reason and logic. And it was the reasoned universe was so powerful, there was no free will for Spinoza. There was no way for there to be free will if everything was known from the beginning by a rational design. So, if we want to believe in free will, then we can have a mythological story. If we want to have an omnipotent God, it's going to be less interesting because he knows how it's going to turn out. Now, the irony is we are the readers. We're neither gods nor characters, but we know how the story turns out. So part of the fun of reading and rereading the stories is seeing how can we get something new out of this? What else can we find in the holes in the story that give us insight into ourselves, into social dynamics, or into the dynamics of the writers of the story. But I want to just touch on chapter 4, which is about Cain and Abel. So the man knew his wife, Eve. This is in the biblical sense of knowing. She conceives and gives birth to Cain. By the way, the word in Hebrew I love, she became pregnant, is vatahar. Literally, the word is she became hilly. The word har is a mountain or a hill. So the verb in Hebrew is to become hilly when you become pregnant. And she gave birth to Cain, because she has acquired him. She kaniti ish, I've acquired a man. She then also gives birth to his brother Abel, Hevel, who doesn't get an explanation for his name. And in fact, the name Abel means sort of like it's in vain, it's useless, it serves no purpose. And in fact, he's just a placeholder for what happens to Cain. But they do something important. They invent professions. Abel becomes a keeper of sheep, a shepherd, and Cain becomes a farmer, a tiller of the soil. And so Cain brings an offering to Yahweh from the fruit of the soil. This is the first sacrifice. You know, if you're a priest writing a story, you always have to include, how am I going to get revenue out of this? Or how am I going to make a living if this is the way the world starts? So let's start with sacrifices right at the beginning. And you, by the way, can do them every 7 days because we already have a holiday in the calendar from Genesis chapter 1. And Abel, for his part, brought the firstlings of his flock. And Yahweh paid attention to Abel and his offering, but he did not pay any attention to Cain and his offering. And Cain was upset. Yahweh said to Cain, why are you worried? If you do right, there will be uplift. But if you do not do right, sin couches at the door. Its urges toward you, but you can be its master. So he says, warning, red light, I see what you're thinking. Cain said to his brother Abel, doesn't say what he said something. And when they were in the field, Cain attacked his brother Abel and killed him. Yahargehu, again, the first murder. And then that profound question that we explored in more depth at our high holiday services. Yahweh said to Cain, where is your brother Abel? And Cain says, I do not know. Hashomer achi anochi, am I my brother's keeper? So again, it's a dialogue of questions. Where is your brother? Just like he said, where is Adam, right? Where are you? God probably knows the answer. And Cain's response is shattering. Am I in charge of my brother? Am I supposed? This is his younger brother. Remember, Cain's the older brother. And even there's 4 people on earth, right? There's not a lot of suspects for this murder. But Cain still says, he claims not to know. And is it really my responsibility? And then God responds with yet another question. Ma asita, what have you done? Behold, your brother's bloods, it's plural in the Hebrew, your brother's bloods cry out to me from the ground. And so you'll be more cursed than the ground. Notice how Adamah, the earth, comes up again and again in these stories. And the earth is now cursed. But now Cain is even more cursed than the earth because the earth received the blood. If you till the soil, it will no longer yield its strength to you. You'll be a wanderer on earth. Cain says, my punishment is too great to bear. I'm going to die. Anyone who meets me, like Eve, what? Again, it doesn't make sense in a rational plotting out the family tree of humanity, but maybe it makes sense in a mythological compilation of stories or imagining in the future there'll be other people. And so Yahweh said to him, I promise if anyone kills Cain, 7-fold vengeance taken against him. And he put a mark on Cain, in theory, to protect him. And so Cain left the presence of Yahweh and settled in the east of Eden, thus the origin of the John Steinbeck novel. Cain knew his wife, and she conceived and bore Enoch, and founded a city and named it after his wife. Well, the rabbis imagine that Cain and Abel were actually born with twin sisters that aren't mentioned, and that's who the wives are. But again, maybe this is a different story that is the story of the first murder, but not of the first family. And so it didn't matter that he found a wife because that was assumed to have other people. And we get the beginning of the begats, generations that get passed along. And we're going to sort of jump forward through all the begatting, which is less interesting. Adam knew his wife again, and she bore a son named Seth in place of Abel. And so Seth in turn has children, and that's how the line continues. And so chapter 5 is all the generations of Adam and so on. We're not going to dive into the depths there. There are a few interesting details here or there. But at the end, we get the sort of hint of the next story. It's a great cliffhanger, actually, the beginning of chapter 6. When men began to increase on the earth and daughters were born to them, Vayiru b'nei ha'Elohim, the sons of the gods, saw how beautiful the daughters of men were, and took wives from among those that pleased them. Whoa! Very mythological, right? But it's also a crossing of the boundary. Remember, Adam is kicked out of Eden. There's angels. There's a guard. You're not supposed to go back that way. And here, now the divine beings are going down to the daughters of men and lusting. And so they're crossing that boundary again. And Yahweh said, my breath will not abide in man forever, since he is flesh. Let the days allotted to him be 120 years. By the way, this is the basis of that Yiddish wish. You should live bis 120 to 120. Goes back to Genesis chapter 6. It was then too, and later, the Nephilim, the giants, appeared on the earth, when the divine beings cohabited with the daughters of men who bore them offspring. Perseus, Hercules, right? The heroes of old, the men of renown. Yahweh saw how great was man's wickedness on earth, how every plan devised by his mind was nothing but evil all the time. And he regretted he had made man on earth. His heart was saddened, and he said, I will blot out from the earth men who I created, men with beasts and all living things. I regret that I made them. But Noah found favor with Yahweh. And that's the cliffhanger. It's all going to go, but Noah gets favor. And the next Torah portion is in fact named Noah. So great cliffhanger to end on, right? It's all gone bad. It's all going down. Again, remember the opposite of the first creation story. Genesis chapter 1, it's in order, it's getting better, and everything is very good on the last day. And God takes a rest. And the siesta is the pinnacle of creation. But in the rest of the story, it goes downhill from there, because you get the first rule breaking, and then you get the first lying, and the first dissembling, and the first murder, and the first family split, and the first violence, and the first crossing of the boundary between heaven and earth, and everything goes downhill, and all people are doing, they're supposed to know good from evil, and all they're doing is evil. And so it's time to wipe the slate and start again. But there is a ray of hope in Noah, and that's where the Torah portion ends, and you got to wait till next week to find out what happens next, if you've never heard the cycle before. So I hope you enjoyed this journey through Genesis, at least the beginning of Genesis, that first Torah portion, Bereshit. I do want to ask if there's any last comments or questions before we have our closing song and send us out into Shabbat and the weekend.
Yeah, I have a comment. So part of what conventional discourse says is we all came from Adam and Eve, but we know that's not true because everything got wiped out and we all came from Noah. But also, some of us didn't come from Adam and Eve. Some of us came from the couplings of the giants and the Elohim with the daughters of men.
They all got, no, those are all the bad people that got wiped out in the flood.
I know, but begging that question of we really all came from Noah, I mean, there was all kinds of stuff. The whole idea we all came from Adam and Eve, that went by the wayside long ago. There's lots of cuts at that one. That's
where do you think they got this idea of giants and blending of human and supernatural?
The Greeks.
Yeah, where did they get it?
The Hebrews. Intertextuality.
No.
The Greeks.
No. Water erodes. Huge bones show up for animals. They have no idea what these things are. Right? They didn't have no theory of dinosaurs or the large, mammals that pre-existed human civilization. And so they had to come up with a story to help explain why these huge bones here. And this one looks like a leg. Well, maybe there were giants at one time, and maybe these giants were part of the divine beings. Again, it's an origin story, right? The Noah story is an origin story for the rainbow is another example. So you can read each of these stories for what is this trying to tell you the origin of, what kind of society is it describing? There's all kinds of lenses you can use to dive into the story, and that's what makes them fruitful in revisiting and grappling with, as long as you don't only read them. That's the weakness of the traditional Jewish study pattern is you go back to the Torah every year and every week. If I had to do the Genesis Torah portion discussion for 20 years in a row, I might be done, right? But the fact that I'm free to do it once in a while makes it continually interesting.
I'm interested in the mark of Cain. What is that all really about? Ot Cain, isn't it? The mark of Cain.
Yes, it's fascinating, right? Because he's a murderer.
It's what?
He's a murderer. You know, you'd think, and we often use the mark of Cain as a sign of evil, right?
Yeah.
But in this case, it's to protect him. If you read the story, it says, I'll put my mark on you and no one will kill you. So again, we don't have enough detail to know what it meant in its original context. Or it could have been, you know, an early version of later biblical legislation where if you committed manslaughter, like an accidental killing, you could go to a city of refuge and then you wouldn't get killed by the clan of the person you killed accidentally.
Okay.
You know, so maybe this is a version of that. Not all people who kill have to die right away.
But it was an actual physical mark.
I think the concept is that there was some kind of visible mark that people would see. And we don't know what it was. Was it a star? Was it a, you know, a bit of ashes? we don't know. You know, but I can imagine a whole wonderful creative story or work of art exploring that question of what the mark of Cain might have looked like.
Well, I find it interesting that they say, you know, Adam and Eve will know good and evil, but there's no talk about what is good. No value system of how to act and what is good. It just goes into all the bad stuff.
They've got no laws. The only commandment they got was be fruitful and multiply. There's lots of ways to do that. Yeah, Sheila and Ron?
What I find fascinating about going through these with a more discerning eye is not so much for the story itself, but if you assume it's written by numerous people, what it tells us about them when they wrote these, because it really gives you an insight into how they looked at their world and how different it is from the world that we see.
Right. Although, again, there are times where I'm surprised to find something so modern human, you know? I mean, imagine you're working on a project and it gets messed up and then it gets messed up worse. And you get so sick of it that all you want to do is just take it up and crumple it up and throw it. That's God in the world at the end of our Torah portion, right? It's gotten so messed up. I'm just going to throw it all, crumple it up and throw it all away and start over again. I mean, once you accept God as a character, right, with emotions and motivation, then this is a very human story about getting frustrated with what you've started and it's gone to hell.
Well, that's the other fascinating thing is even when you look at the emotions involved, how little human nature, if you want to call it that, has changed over the millennia.
Right, right. Well, that's what makes these stories so powerful. And, you know, there are other stories from the same time period that have a similar kind of echo and resonance. If you've ever read anything of the Epic of Gilgamesh, it's really fascinating. And it's about a quest for eternal life because his close friend has died and he wants to bring him back to life and he misses him and he's lonely. And so again, that pathos of the human condition and the fear of death, and it's all there. And there's even a flood story in the Gilgamesh epic too that might have been earlier than the Noah flood story. But that's what makes timeless literature timeless, is that it's part of the human condition. And so I would say Genesis qualifies. It's not the only one. There's plenty more beyond it, but it is a good example of it.